Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Caruso. I'm a reporter with Spotlight, Pennsylvania, a Capitol reporter. It's been a busy few days, few weeks. Thank you for spending your Thursday evening with us. We're looking forward to talking you through Pennsylvania's state budget. For those of you who are new to our programming, Spotlight PA is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit newsroom producing investigative and public service journalism about state government and urgent statewide issues. We can't do any of this work without you, our members, and those of you who support our efforts. You can learn more about us on our website, spotlightpa.org. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Tonight's event will be recorded and posted on our website tomorrow for those of you who could not join us. And thank you to everyone who submitted a question in advance. If you'd like to submit a question during the event, you can also do so in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible towards the end of our program. So without further ado, we're here to talk about the state budget. Pennsylvania entered this year with a almost $15 billion surplus at the end of June. That was built up due to federal stimulus aid that came into the state during the pandemic. Then 2 weeks past our June 30th deadline, lawmakers agreed to a $47.6 billion budget that put about $1 billion new into public education in response to a landmark state court ruling. But a number of key priorities were left on the table, from tax cuts to public transit. So to break down what is inside of this budget, we have three guests with us. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to our guests.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Christina Moon. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior attorney at the Education Law Center of Pennsylvania. We're a nonprofit legal services organization with a mission to ensure a quality public education for all students in Pennsylvania. We are one of the firms that brought the statewide challenge to the underfunding of our public schools, along with Public Interest Law Center and O'Melveny. And I'll be sharing more about that case and the implications for the budget as we go forward tonight.
Next. Good evening, everyone. Mustafa Rashid, President and CEO of Bellevue Strategies. Bellevue Strategies is a government relations firm based out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We work across the state. We were deeply involved in negotiations and parts and processes of working on the budget this year, as we are for our clients every year, and looking forward to having this discussion with you this evening. I said to my colleagues here before you got on, it's exciting that there are people who, in regards to what's happening in the national news and how that's changing every 5 minutes, are excited about talking about the state's budget. So we're happy to be here. We hope to make this the best use of your time.
Hello, everyone. This is Stan Saylor. I am past Republican Majority Chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, and currently am involved with One Plus Strategies in Harrisburg. It's a consultant and lobbying firm, as well as a law firm as well. And I look forward to answering your questions this evening.
So with all that said, we're going to jump right into the biggest issue that sort of dominated debates, closed door and publicly, about in this budget, which was education spending. So back last decade, as Christina mentioned, Education Law Center and numerous other groups filed a challenge to Pennsylvania's school funding system, alleging that it unconstitutionally underfunded poorer school districts. Now that worked its way through the courts, and after a lot of process in 2023, a state judge handed down a ruling that said the state was in fact underfunding these poor districts and unconstitutionally depriving students in them of their right to an efficient education. So that ruling sort of has dominated how we've thought, how the state and the state lawmakers have approached budgeting and policy for the past year or so. There were some investments made in last year's budget, 2023, which turned into a 6-month impasse. And then this year, education, as I said at the top, was another top area of investment, about $1 billion in new funding. Of that, $225 million went directly to school districts. So school districts are getting about $8.1 billion directly from the state. There was also $100 million more for special education, $100 million for school mental health and safety, and $100 million for school construction. The biggest bucket, however, is $500 million just for this idea of adequacy. And to explain what adequacy is, I was going to ask Christina if you could jump in here, because this was a really key part of the lawsuit that ELC filed and won, correct? Was this idea of what is adequacy and how are we not getting that for poor districts?
Absolutely, thanks. And I'm going to step back a little bit to just give everyone a mini primer on the decision that we received from the Commonwealth Court in February of 2023. It was 786 pages long. I will not be discussing all the details. But based on an analysis of the state constitution, the court found that education is a fundamental right in Pennsylvania. So that means it has to be prioritized above other obligations that are not fundamental rights in the Constitution. The court agreed with and found violations on both of our claims, that the state funding was inadequate and inequitably distributed, discriminating against low wealth communities that couldn't afford to provide the reading specialists, the quality teachers, the counselors, challenging courses, contemporary textbooks and materials, safe buildings, and more that students really need to succeed. So two fronts were found unconstitutional, that there was not enough money provided from the state and that it wasn't distributed based on students' needs. And much of the judge's 786-page ruling went to rejecting the argument that money doesn't matter, and in fact found that specific resources are actually required and proven to be effective in underfunded schools. So the court directed the legislature and the governor to fix this, to make it constitutional, and to ensure that all students receive a meaningful opportunity to succeed academically, socially, and civically, which requires that all students have access to a comprehensive, effective, and contemporary system of public education. The court ordered the state to create a plan that provides all students in every district throughout Pennsylvania with an adequately funded education. So adequacy here refers to how much money a school needs to be able to provide that adequate education. What the court found was comprehensive, effective, and contemporary education. And previously, there was no state law requirement to actually identify how much money an adequate education would cost, and no goal for states to actually meet that. So it's a huge step to acknowledge this problem of the adequacy gap, that many districts need more state funds in order to provide an adequate education because they're not able to raise enough money based on their lower property wealth in their districts to provide the same amount of services that a higher wealth community can. And so legislators this year finally agreed that adequately funded education requires at least an additional $4.5 billion distributed to lower wealth communities. And that $4.5 billion figure is based on a formula setting adequacy targets for eligible districts. And then importantly here, there's only a commitment to this first year step toward closing that gap between higher wealth districts and lower wealth districts. So that 1 year investment, as Stephen said, is the $494 million toward that $4.5 billion gap. And that will become part of the foundation or base going forward. But it's important that this, for the first time, the amount to the basic education funding is less because we're putting the majority into these adequacy dollars to try to make up this gap. It's prioritizing equity first to ensure that kids actually receive what they need where they have not been getting what they need.
Just to follow up, that seems like the best way to think about that $500 million for adequacy is that's going right to the poor districts that are that have been found to have the most harm from not having the sort of a high wealth property base, or have students that are in the most need of the money to make up the gap between, you know, how much money they have now and what is decided as adequate based on this formula, correct?
Yep, that's fair.
So another thing too that did come up towards the end and held up negotiations was that adequacy formula. It ended up trying to identify impoverished districts through census data instead of individual data that looked at the number of students in each school who actually were, dealing with poverty. And this was a really big issue that was a compromise that Senate Republicans, forced the issue on, but I know education advocates have some concerns about. Could you, how does using census data versus individual school data impact what schools are getting money and what aren't, Christina?
Yeah, right. And so the background is, of course, that there are multiple factors about the types of students, the particular populations and the needs that they have, and an understanding that certain student populations require more funds in order to meet their needs. And experts agree that poor students face greater barriers and higher needs that result in higher costs to provide that adequate education. And so this year, the legislators artificially reduced the size of the state's funding shortfall by undercounting the students in poverty. For years, poverty figures school districts report to the state calculate economically disadvantaged population in their district, the students actually attending, based on multiple measures of hardship. Students are certified as low income if, for example, they receive food stamps or other public benefits, if they're in the foster care system, if they're migrants, or if they're experiencing homelessness. That's a calculation based on the actual students' experience in these schools. Compared to this measure that was used this year is a census estimate of community poverty. It's the American Community Survey measure. It's less accurate because it's a yearly estimate with a margin of error, with a small sample size, and it includes children who are not attending our public schools because it's an estimate of the larger community, and it's self-reported. So this definitely needs to be fixed going forward, because this year that adjustment really reduced the amount of money available under these calculations for schools that absolutely need additional funds.
So we were talking a lot about education investments, but another area that got a lot of attention in this year's budget was higher education. So the General Assembly actually passed a bill sponsored by Senate Republicans to create a scholarship program to incentivize students who stay in Pennsylvania post-graduation if they enter specific fields that are in demand, from engineering, computer science, nursing, criminal justice. They allocated $25 million for this. And this actually mirrors a program that the General Assembly put the ixnay on under Governor Tom Wolf, who preceded Governor Josh Shapiro. And so Chairman Saylor, I kind of wanted to go to you. What do you think is different from 2019 when Governor Wolf first proposed this plan, which I think he called Nellie Bly, and now that has made the General Assembly feel comfortable making this scholarship program that is now part of our state budget?
It's more focused in what the Governor Wolf's proposal was, I think, and also realization, I think, of many legislators that the study has come out that in Pennsylvania by 2030, just about 5.5 years from now, that 30% of Pennsylvania's population is going to be 65 or older. And I know the governor, as well as members of both parties, are trying to figure out how to, with our job shortage, particularly those fields that are funding, can build Pennsylvania back to the state that it used to be as a keystone state. So I think realization is setting in with members of the General Assembly. I think the confusion has been in the past, and I think there's still a lot of consensus to be built, is that we have to do something. And this is the first step. And I look for them to continue in next year's budget to do some additional things. But it really comes down to whether you're a nursing home or a hospital right now, they're fighting to staff their facilities and take care of patients. And it's becoming very difficult for hospitals and nursing homes to do so and take good care of patients and quality care. I think that when we talk about engineering, the Department of Transportation needs engineers, and there's a shortage of that. But it's not the only industry that does. So I think it's just like, I think it finally, Democrats and Republicans are coming together and saying, how best can we build economic development in Pennsylvania? How can we keep young people here? And I think that we've done some of these things in a minor way. We have done some programs in the past for nurses, but that was a small amount. We've done small amounts to keep doctors here, family physicians here. So now they're just expanding on that in a major way, and I hope that continues to grow, because if we don't, we're going to find that we have a major crisis here. In fact, we already have a crisis in the nursing home and hospital area as far as nursing care is concerned.
And I'm also interested, another part of this higher ed approach was creating performance-based funding for the state-related universities. So that's Penn State, Pitt, Temple, and Lincoln. They're, some of the flagship universities of the state. And this is now going to route their money through a formula that tries to decide if they're doing a good job of educating kids. The exact writing of the formula is TBD, but this was a big deal because state-related funding has sort of been a tricky thing because of some legislative, there's been legislative pushback on it in recent years. So Chairman, do you think it's a good idea? Do you think it'll make it easier to pass budgets going forward?
I do. One of the problems we've had in the past is our state system. Chancellor Greenstein has done an amazing job in reforming our state colleges and universities that are owned by the state. Before, they were giving degrees in poetry and everything else, and these kids were coming out of school. I shouldn't call them kids. Young men, young women are coming out of school, and they couldn't find jobs in the fields that they had degrees in. Now, Chancellor Greenstein and the presidents of these universities have refocused what their degrees they're giving, how they can work with community colleges and trade schools and the high schools in getting kids started early with any number of credits they can take while they're still in high school. So performance gives you an idea for the General Assembly to say, this is working, this isn't working, and why isn't it? And you can now question with the evidence a university's president, because in the past, a legislator or a group of legislators, doesn't matter which party, would say this isn't working. And of course, presidents of universities never like to say that they're not getting the job done, as true as anybody does in any industry. But now we have to do a better job in Pennsylvania for our students. We have more college universities than any state in the nation, but we don't seem to be holding on to our students that are here. So I think between what we're doing in performance-based budgeting, we're going to have better quality students graduating, and we will also be able to keep those students here who now are leaving for states south of us or states in the Midwest.
Taking a step back, Christina, I just want to turn back to you. Is there anything in the educational components of the budget that we've talked about that should be brought up that you'd say like ELC is happiest with, they think is the biggest step forward for the state?
Well, I think they have to come together. Christine talked about the funding formula. Legislators, there's two reports. I served on the funding commission the last time, and I also served as the commissioner of education representing Pennsylvania nationally when I was over the last 10 years. And what we're not doing enough, other states are doing in holding school districts accountable. We're seeing superintendents come in, and we have to come up with a way. When a superintendent is poorly functioning, when grades go down in a school district, testing scores go down, somebody has to be accountable. And I personally, as a taxpayer, am tired of teachers being blamed, parents being blamed. Look, I always say this: if you're president of the Ford Motor Company and your company is doing poorly, it's the president's problem. It's his responsibility. As a superintendent, you ask for that job, you apply for that job. Your job is to make that school better. And Christine's right, funding is very critical, but so is how you spend those dollars. We've seen school districts who, and I give you an example here in York County. We had a school district that bought $100,000 tickets to Hershey Park and never used those. They were supposed to be used as gifts for kids, for doing well. They bought cases of stopwatches, which nobody knows why. And they all went to waste. So it's those kind of things. Those were federal dollars, by the way, not state dollars that were used to do that. We also have to focus, and I think all the states have to do a better job of getting Congress and the president, Republicans and Democrats alike, put more money into special education. Right now, I think the state is receiving from the federal government about 7% of what the federal government promised. And they promised they would always fund special education at 40%. That's billions of dollars Pennsylvania and other states, well, just Pennsylvania alone is losing in that. And that's a very expensive proposition for these school districts. And depending where you are as a school district, what area of the state, whether you're urban, suburban, rural, you'll have more students than maybe some other school district, which is also impacting their budget.
Christina, yeah, turning to you, is there anything in the budget that you feel is like, worth celebrating, or something else that you think is worth noting within this, within the plan that was passed?
Yeah, we'd absolutely agree that special education is one of the highest line items and needs additional funding for sure. We're looking at also facilities. There was $250 million, I think, earmarked for additional facilities repair, but that's between 500 different school districts across the state, right? And that's a dramatic underfunding given the amount of old and crumbling facilities that were identified in our lawsuit with our petitioner districts, and we know exist across the state. There's like $1 billion, $4 billion, up to $7 billion, I think, in Philadelphia identified alone. So we need a lot larger investment in facilities. Also, pre-K and early childhood needs additional investments. This was also identified and found to be really important and impactful for students making progress and receiving an adequate education in our case. So there needs additional investment in those areas as well. I'd say what's good is, as I started with the emphasis or the final recognition on this gap and actually calculating a gap. What we need is a multi-year plan. With billions of dollars of surplus, we shouldn't have to decide between fixing the leaks and having enough reading specialists to get kids on reading level for something that is a fundamental right in our Constitution. It's all important, and these significant needs remain unaddressed until we have a multi-year plan that actually lays out how each year we're going to contribute enough to actually close the gap on a reasonable timeline.
Yeah. And I feel like, that was a big tension. It seemed like going into the close of debates was that like there's a desire for among Democrats to make sure that there is a locked in spending. But of course, Republicans were looking at the fact that the state does have the surplus, but surplus can go away real quick. And that seemed to sort of drive a lot of debate. Now, Mustafa, I want to bring in you because, I kind of started off by saying too, is that there are a lot of things that kind of didn't get into this budget. I feel like the story of this budget, as much of what was left on the cutting room floor, is what was in. Republicans wanted to get income tax cut. They didn't get that. Democrats had advocated for a minimum wage increase. They have for a while, and they didn't get that. Josh Shapiro called for the legalization of recreational marijuana, and he didn't get that. I guess, is there anything of those things I mentioned or something else that you're surprised didn't make its way into this budget?
The surprise that did or did not?
Did not make its way into this
It
budget.
did not. Well, I thought that, and I know the advocates for minimum wage, we've been talking about this for quite some time, thought that the moment was right, thought that with Democrats having a majority in the House, that the timing and the opportunity was there to push that forward, and to see that not make it. I mean, I know there's legislation in the Pennsylvania Senate that made it seem like it was possible to happen. So like that did not happen. I'm more personally, as a Southeast native, troubled at the not enough support for public transportation for SEPTA. And I know that was a top priority for many, many people across not just in the Southeast, but across the Commonwealth, because that impacts how people go to school, how people go to work, how people live, how people go to doctor's appointments. Hell, it impacts how people go to go and vote. So, SEPTA has to try to figure that out with a minimal amount of funding. And it doesn't seem, it's certainly not sustainable to fund your state's major public transportation infrastructure system with not enough recurring dollars to make them keep operations the same. You're looking at either service cuts or fare hikes, which are not great. So I was very surprised to see that did not make it the way that I thought that it would. Minimum wages, you mentioned, I thought medical marijuana or recreational marijuana was a different animal entirely, and I didn't have a lot of confidence that would get there. I think there were just too many dissenting voices and not enough agreement about what that should ultimately look like. But I put minimum wage and public transportation funding up there as top priorities that did not get taken care of the way that I think many people thought they should.
I want to jump in there really quick, say, as Mustafa said, so the budget did include about $80 million going to public transit and just general operational aid, but this is a one-time spend. So this is just $80 million the state was allocating for this year. Josh Shapiro in his budget had said he wanted to increase the transfer of sales tax. He wanted to bump that up, the amount, by about 1.75%, which would have led to about $270 million going to public transit agencies such as SEPTA, PRT, but also smaller agencies across the state. So that was something that didn't make it in. And one thing that had been tossed around, Mustafa, this idea of like regulating. I don't know if this is something you can comment on, but regulating skill games as a potential bucket of money, a side deal that was thrown in as potential, like regulate these. They're the things that are popping up in taverns across the state. And corner stores, and trying to use that revenue for public transit. As a Philadelphian too, do you have a sense of, do you think that's something that Philadelphia residents or lawmakers would have been okay with?
I think so. Obviously, there needs to be a call for regulation for it. I would say to this, and this goes back to the work that Christina and her team have been doing, is that any enterprise in any part of the state that's ducking its fair share or any share of school taxes is a loss to the school districts in which they operate. And so I think that there are a lot of people and a lot of interest would have liked to see legalized, regulated, and properly enforced moving forward. And I hope that that's a discussion that continues as we move ahead.
And Stan, I want to bring you in on this because one thing that at least Senate Republicans were saying is on public transit that they were interested in that conversation, but they thought it had to be tied in with road and bridge funding. They see it as two conversations that kind of have to go together. As a Republican, a rural Republican, I'm sure there might have been some buses in your district, but I just want to check, like, do you think there's any chance for a deal to be cut in the last couple months of session to address this issue that's top priority for a lot of Democrats across the state? I mean, a lot of people across the state.
No. The reason being is look, it has always been a custom, long before I was a legislator, and I was there 30 years, for transportation funding, mass transit as well as roads and bridges to be funded all at one time so that everybody was getting something. And I get what Chris or Mustafa was talking about in Philadelphia, the importance of it. And so what needs to come together is, and the governor probably needs to lead this. I know he may have some other things going on, but it always takes the governor and the Secretary of Transportation to sit down with Republicans and Democrats and figure out how much money does it take for highways and bridges to get funding for SEPTA, the Port Authority in Pittsburgh, and other bus transportation. We have mass transit here in York. So it's going to be like, do we tax packages from Prime and UPS? Do we raise the gas tax? And I tell people all the time, and I voted for every gas tax that came before me. As a legislator, it's the best thing you can do is invest in your infrastructure. If you want to attract jobs and keep young people here and good jobs here and companies moving here. Because we have a great deal in Pennsylvania. I don't think Pennsylvanians appreciate, and that is our gas tax might be one of the 5 top, I think it's 5th in the country of highest. But if you're in Virginia, not only do you have a gas tax in Virginia, but they have a personal property tax of $1,400 a year if you have a $30,000 car that you pay annually. Now that $1,400 and their gas tax goes to pay for their roads. We don't have that in Pennsylvania. We don't, and I'm not suggesting we should, but our gas tax is a user tax. You don't pay any more if you're mom and you're just driving to the grocery store and the doctor's office. So I think that we need to understand, for seniors in particular, mass transit is very important. Low-income families, it's important as well. But even for the environment, if we can get more and more people using mass transit, it saves on that. But unless, and it always has taken a governor, it doesn't matter which governor, Democrat, Republican, they have got to kind of take the lead, because in the end, this is the question that every legislator, Republican and Democrat, is going to ask the governor and the Secretary of Transportation: which highways in my district are getting fixed with this when I vote for this? So that's why it takes a governor to do that. And I think Josh is up to that, doing that. He and Austin Davis are outstanding. I consider my friends with both of them. They have great relations with both sides of the aisle. So it's going to take some intense work, just like you talked about the skill games. It's just they haven't quite gotten there yet. And I think I'm surprised it didn't get done this year. Marijuana, I did not think would get done, simply because they're still having problems with the medical marijuana. There's some issues there that they've been working out, and I think they did some things with that this year. But Mustafa talked about the importance, and he's so right. But it's going to take a governor's lead and his secretary to explain it. And the other thing that will happen there is these contractors will also start lobbying their legislators, which will be very helpful. The planning commissions in each of the counties will get involved. So that's what it takes. It takes because remember, you're raising taxes. It doesn't matter how you raise taxes. It's not a popular thing with anybody.
I kind of want to jump in there with like the conversation. Obviously, we've been talking about a lot of things that are needs, and our chat is even popping up with people asking about property taxes and concerns about the weight on them. We've been talking about education funding and the fact that Christina, you were going down a bunch of things that are funded, but that there's still a need for more funding. I mean, public transit, that's another thing. The state had has had a big surplus. It's going down after this spending. We're spending about $3 billion out of that, and I'm just sort of curious. For Stan, Mustafa, I mean, Christina, whoever wants to jump in, I'm just, is the state's fiscal future a real problem? Is there a way, like, the state has a lot of money right now, but is this enough to handle all the investments we've been talking about here? and actually be able to fund, all of the different needs that are coming up and continually coming up as we go through all of the areas that need to be funded.
I'll comment first. I think the most important thing right now is not education funding is important, but I think we have to do it in a process. You can't do it all at one time. One, because it does no good to spend all that money in education if you can't keep these people here, and how do you pay for it in the long run? In other words, Pennsylvania's income tax, I think, is a fairly fair tax. It's one of the lower ones in the country. But at the same time, like I said, raising taxes is not popular. That deficit, if you look at what the Independent Fiscal Office has said about Pennsylvania, is we are headed to a deficit. Because when you spend like the $2 billion, we did bring in enough money this year to pay for this year's new budget. We had to borrow from, of course, the savings. Well, when you spend $2 billion this year, that automatically means you've spent $4 billion, because that $2 billion this year is also got to be spent next year just to keep the funding level. That doesn't count for inflation and additional investment you're going to need in education and in some of these other programs that we've talked about earlier. So we have to be very careful, because we really don't know where this economy is heading. I mean, the economy, economists keep talking about hitting some kind of a recession at some point, no matter who's president. And so I think the state needs to be careful. The whole point of the rainy day fund was to save the state, to not have to cut things like they did during the Corbett years, where they were cutting funding to higher ed and a lot of programs were cut. And let's be honest, politicians, members of the House, the Senate, and the governor have to answer to taxpayers when it comes to reelection. So taxes do not get people reelected. And that's, one of the things when I lost my primary to another Republican here, I lost because of my gas tax vote. But I'm not ashamed of it. I think you have to make what decisions is right. And I think if it's mass transit we need to do, then that's what we need to do. Or if it's education. I've always been a believer that as a politician, if you do the right thing, everything works out.
I would say to that, the counterpoint on the state's rainy day fund is that there are many communities across the Commonwealth, communities, municipalities, townships, cities, what have you, that think it's been raining for a while, and think that the rainy day fund should be used to make critical investments so that Pennsylvania can grow from within. And saving money for a rainy day when people feel like it's been raining for a while is problematic. And I know that a lot of advocates across the state, be it for infrastructure investments or workforce development, for job training, for other things that people feel that they need, that the state could contribute, that with a historical budget and to hold back funding and an opportunity to make historical investments doesn't make sense to the average person. I know that inside the Capitol, it makes sense to people, and people look at standards and ratings and credits and bond and how much it costs to borrow money and what your overall rating is. But for the average Pennsylvania who feels like they've paid taxes, that the state could do more to invest in their communities, I think that they feel like this budget could have done more. And I know that's been a growing theme for the past 2 years with the historic money. I think there's still federal money that has not been used yet. And unlike, I think the fiscal prudence that's been different than when the chairman mentioned during the Corbett years is that funding won't be used for recurring costs. This funding could be used for one-time costs, so that you're not creating a permanent deficit. You're not building into something that's not going to last for the future, certainly not putting it into education and then have it go away. It's, one-time initial costs that could be used for investments, for startups, for businesses, for jobs, for cleaning blight in community. Like, there's a lot of things that these investments could be done. I think people in Pennsylvania would like to see that.
And I would just share that, we know from the research presented by experts in our trial, and there was another recent study from Penn that's showing that investment in education is the best long-term investment. It reduces criminal justice involvement. It increases like all economic outcomes. So really, this is not only a fundamental right requiring focus on education investment, but also what's best for our communities and our Commonwealth. And just to respond also to some questions in the chat, I think I saw about property tax. If folks aren't aware, there is a line item for some tax equity relief, $32 million. So that districts like Pottstown is the one that always comes to mind for me, but those that have responded to chronic underfunding by increasing and increasing and increasing their own property taxes to really high rates, that unfortunately, due to the the level of wealth in their community still don't allow them to meet adequacy for their schools. This budget does provide some relief, but only to those districts in the 90th percentile of tax effort. And by comparison, and what I think we need to continue to advocate for is HB 2370 would have gone to districts in the top third. So this is reducing a much smaller sliver of only districts that are at the very highest. I think we are at, it would have been 100 districts and is down to 30 or something.
And what I would say to Christine to that is, I understand what you're saying. The problem is the politics, and it's not Democrat Republican politics. It's the other, 400 school districts who aren't going to get the funding, who say, my people are paying taxes as they too. And that's where the problem has been for years, has been the politics of getting legislators. And that's where compromise is so important. I think that's the biggest problem sometimes of politics today, is you don't have to get the exact same money in, say, education, but then you need to get that money somewhere else for your needs in your community, your legislative district. And that sometimes has seemed to be more and more difficult as we've gotten into a more, I won't say partisan, more even Republicans stabbing Republicans and Democrats stabbing Democrats in the back, because I'm trying to be popular on Facebook, Snapchat, whatever the media is, Twitter, X now. I think we are getting away from compromising, understanding what Christine needs versus what Stan needs. It's two different things. And so what can I do to help Christine, and how can Christine help Stan get things that he needs in his community? And that's what's not been working, I think, in government lately.
Well, and I think to that, what the court found is that the state has the responsibility to all school districts across the Commonwealth to make sure that all school districts are able to provide an adequate education. So those that don't have the property wealth can't be discriminated against because they have lower wealth in their communities. The state has to provide the difference, has to bridge that gap. So, wealthier school districts can absolutely provide additional beyond what is considered the adequate education, but the state's responsible for bridging the gap. So that's what we're looking for in budgets going forward.
I want to jump in with, we're going to start getting the audience questions. So if you have any questions, get them into the Q&A. We're going to transition, but I kind of want to just sort of close with a, as I was trying to set up here, is that, so the state had $15 billion in savings coming into this budget. We're now down to about 12 billion or so, about 3 billion was used. There's more in the rainy day fund. And then there's an estimate from the IFO office, the Independent Fiscal Office. I think Chairman Saylor brought them up, that the state might be out of those funds within the next two years or so. And I'm just sort of curious if like if I were to do a lightning round, it seems like that means either within the next 2 years, lawmakers are going to have to come up with a way to cut spending or raise taxes. That's kind of how this works. And I'm just curious if, so is that a correct way to look at this? We're gonna have to cut spending or raise taxes, or maybe a mix of both within the next, 2 to 3 years. Stan?
Well, I think that Governor Shapiro it's got to be, he's conscious. He served with me in the General Assembly, and that he cannot afford to raise taxes and get reelected if he's going to stay as governor. And that's just nature. I mean, Governor Rendell understood that, even though he proposed tax increases. Tom Wolf did too. It was, it's difficult. Everybody's, it's not just the middle class is suffering, the low income families are suffering. And there's a real need with our seniors in Pennsylvania and so on and so forth. So nobody likes the word tax cuts or tax increases. So I think that he will be very judicious in how he spends that surplus over the next 2 years. And that's why I say putting all the money and solving every problem would be great. And I think there's still some problems they could have solved in this budget, as Mustafa talked about. But you do have to be careful. And again, there were things that Democrats didn't want to give in on. There were things Republicans didn't want to give in on. Possibly in next year's budget, that'll change. There'll be a more broad look. It won't be an election year. And, let's be honest. If you're a Republican and you're raising the spending levels pretty high, you're going to get pretty criticized back home. If you're a Democrat and you don't push for more spending, you're going to get criticized back home. So it's where the two parties have to come together and decide what, and in an election year, it's very difficult. That's why the budget actually got done this year quicker than last year's, because it's an election year. Nobody wants to be blamed for having a really, really late budget just because they're fighting over one program over another. So I think things that didn't get funded this year will be funded next year.
Mustafa?
I think that that's accurate. It being an election year and people had things to do, they needed to get back and show what they were able to get done in their district. I always laugh at how the things that happen outside of the building impact things that are in the building. There were two major conventions that are happening this summer that people needed to physically be at. And so you couldn't be in two places and your presence was required elsewhere. And so that created more of a sense of urgency than normal would, than even just last summer. So it being a presidential election year as well, I think there's a lot of business that people wanted to get done. I'm hopeful that with the spirit of cooperation, that the things that were left out of the budget this past month, that those promises to address them in the fall come to fruition. I'm again particularly concerned about public transportation, and that they do come back this fall and that they work on that and work on and get some other issues getting ready to be set up for next spring and those discussions next year.
We're going to turn to some of the questions we've gotten. And oh, Christina, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. I was going to say it's not our particular area of expertise about the how funds are raised, but we could choose to focus public funds on public schools and save some money from instead of allowing public funds to go to private schools in a voucher program is one suggestion.
Yeah.
And I also a third rail right there that are there'll be more on Spotlight PA very soon. Well, I do want to start on some of the audience questions we've gotten, and one of them, Christina, I did want to turn to you. We got a question about the cyber charter funding, and there are some reforms to how cyber charters are. How they get money from the state. There's going to now be a state reimbursement, bringing back a line item from the Corbett years. There's also a cap on cyber charter special education tuition, and we had a question about if that violated the violated FAPE. I'm curious, is that something that you can address?
FAPE is a free appropriate public education. That's an entitlement for all students with disabilities under federal law. There might be a misunderstanding here. There's not a cap. So what happened here is that under prior law or current law, until this is effective, the special education add-on tuition rate for charter school students was based on an assumption that districts have 16% of their population students with disabilities. But in fact, many schools actually have more than 16% students with disabilities. So the school code bill changes that calculation to use each school district's actual special ed average daily membership in place of that outdated 16% assumption. So that's actually a right sizing. And will provide funding based on the actual populations. And yes, to also a reimbursement line for some stranded costs to districts when students leave for charters.
If I could, Christina, when you mentioned right sizing, it triggered some other thoughts in my head about right sizing. And please correct me if I'm wrong, Christina. The funding that your team and people in the education space are advocating for, from what I've seen, appears to be funding levels from 5 years ago. And so to ask to be advocate, I mean, you have to do the work, and advocacy is important. It needs to happen all the time. But advocating for funding from some time ago, like there's still a perpetual deficit being created for what schools need. In that same regard, one of the issues that you mentioned, Stephen, about the minimum wage, advocates are asking for a wage that was appropriate in 2015, and it's now almost 2025. And so while you need to move the needle on those, it's also important to be aware of the time that it takes to move the needle and what the actual numbers are that are going to make a difference in people's lives by the time it actually happens.
Yeah, it seems like there's always that time element of action. Sometimes it takes years for something done in one budget year to impact down the line in another.
Yes.
So another question. Speaking of that, we did get a question about property taxes, which is when casino gambling was legalized in Pennsylvania, it was done by Governor N. Rendell, who promised that it would reduce property taxes. And this is from Paul M. He just said, despite record earnings from casinos and online casinos, the public has not seen a significant reduction in property taxes. And he was just wondering, he thought this warrants further investigation by members of the House or Senate. So, Stan, I am just curious, as someone who was around for that, like, what happened with the casino revenue that it didn't end up leading to these property tax reductions that were promised at the time?
It was a lie. Let's be honest. I even said that when the casinos passed. I voted against the casinos because it was being passed because it was a lie. There is never enough money to provide. We have the highest casino tax in the country of any of the gambling states, and yet we're not able to bring enough money in to give real property tax relief. I'm one of those who've been fighting for property tax reform or elimination for years. I've been an advocate saying either do an income tax, do a sales tax, or do a little of each. It was just a big lie that politicians on both sides of the aisle, in my opinion, backed up by Governor Rendell, promised. And it just never was going to happen. I told people that they would be lucky if they lived outside of Philadelphia, maybe Pittsburgh or a Scranton or a Reading. They might be lucky if they got $250, and people inside those cities might get $500. And $500 in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or Scranton or Reading is not enough to get rid of property taxes, let alone those of us out in the rest of the state. Mm-hmm. And I hate to say a lie, but it was just a political exaggeration to get the casinos here. And it's a shame because I know people still believe somebody's stealing money from the casinos. The truth is, we have the highest tax on casinos of any state in the nation.
Yeah. I also want to, I'm going to run through one or two questions I was able to dig up answers for, though if anyone on the panel wishes to jump in, I'm happy to. We had one question from Noah, was there an increase in the Medicaid funding for nursing homes? Some of these places have merged or gone out of business because they cannot cover costs with current funding. And no, there was $120 million more for nursing homes, and that includes a bump in the Medicaid reimbursement rate. So, but that's also it kind of going back to a theme of this conversation. I think nursing homes are still saying, this isn't going to kick in until next year, that increased rate. So they're worried about the 6 months between now and when that rate will go up. So there was an increase there. And we also had a question on community college funding. There was a question on specific allocations. I can't help you with that, but I will say there was $277 million to community colleges in this budget. That's a 6% increase. And there's also a new line item, $7 million for dual enrollment funding. This is, a high school student who's also enrolled in community college for credits. That was something that Democrats in the House have been talking about as part of the higher education discussions. And then we also had a question about information on the proposed disability funding. This was something that Governor Josh Shapiro had talked about. This is funding for people who are adults with disabilities who sometimes need an aid or maybe living in a group home. They have federal government will kick in some money for that. The state has to match it to get people off of a waiting list for emergency care that lets them live out in the community. Josh Shapiro had called for that to be increased, and there was an 11% increase for the community waiver, as it's called. That was about $261 million. And there is also a bump in the reimbursement rates for the workers who work with people with disabilities to allow them to live independently. So let's see here. We also had some questions about, I want to, we've got a few questions about school property taxes. We had that with, we had the question on casino gambling, but so this is from Ronald S. Where is the conversation on school property tax elimination as was covered in the BEFC meetings? And we also had from someone without a name is, where is the conversation over reliance on school property taxes, discussion of the tax equity supplement that was included in the Ready to Learn block grant, but they're concerned there will be no oversight on where money goes. So Christina, if I'm not mistaken, you brought up the fact that there is some money for high tax districts, but it's a much smaller ask than what was originally proposed in the original plan that House Democrats passed, correct?
That's right. I think what was actually passed was 32 million to districts with 90% or above tax effort rate versus the Democrat proposal of 136 million. So a much smaller share.
Is there a chance that this is something that's reapproached, do you think next year in further discussions around how is adequacy reached? How is education funding? The mandate of that rolling reach, do you think school property taxes and reducing that burden in some of these communities is something that has to be part of that conversation?
Absolutely. It was central to the court's decision, recognizing that these districts with lower wealth are taxing themselves at much higher rates and still not able to raise the same amount of money needed to actually provide an adequate education. So that focus, and as I was saying before, the obligation of the state to make up that difference so that lower wealth communities are not discriminated against is absolutely a focus that needs attention.
Do you think there's going to be enough accountability in how the money is driven out right now through, I believe, block grants instead of like maybe through a formula, or however House Democrats proposed it?
Um, I don't know if I personally have, the block grants are familiar to schools. There's a wide range of services that are, eligible under them that schools are already using. So I don't think that I have a problem with that.
Mhm.
It's already, going to teacher professional development, reducing class sizes, more staff. It can address academic curriculum supports.
Mhm. Yeah. And we got a question about a popular program, Whole Home Repairs, that was not funded in this budget. This was from Randy L. And he just asked, why did Whole Home Repairs not get funded this year or last year, even though it's a very popular program across the state? And funding would have been a very small part of the budget, which is a question I think a lot of people ask themselves about a lot of line items. Mustafa, do you want to take a run at that?
I have to say that it's been the peculiarness of it not being funded 2 years in a row is concerning. Because this is a bill that Republicans are good with, that rural people are good with, that urban people are good with. And so it feels like there's something else at play, that this is being used possibly not in the way that it was intended, because like on its face that people support the policy. And like you said, the funding is, I don't want to say it's negligible, but it does, the way the program's been demonstrated is that it has a cost savings to do it and a cost to not do it. And so why it's still being held up, I'm not 100%. I have some ideas. I'm not 100% sure why, but I'm hopeful that those internal conflicts and the proper support for it gets it through the next time.
Stan, as you were appropriations chair in 2022 when Whole Home Repairs first came about. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a tool that, and I think Mustafa's right. It's pretty popular with everybody, but it's still, I think, thought of as more of a democratic proposal. And I think, again, I think it'll be funded. I do think, like I said, when you look at next year's budget, it will be interesting. But I think that's a program that will make its way back. It's just budget negotiations have to be a give and take. You get something, and I think that's one of the things we sometimes miss, the general public, even the business community. It's like negotiating a contract if you're a business person. I want you to cut your costs. Well, then you got to do this and do that. Well, the same thing is true in the General Assembly. Who benefits from the program most? I think, as Mustafa said, everybody really does across the state.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think some Republicans look at it as a Democratic proposal. So they want something in exchange for funding the program. And that's my best guess, is why maybe it didn't get funded this year. But it has been, and you're exactly right, Mustafa, but it has been a very successful and well-liked program. But I have not heard if there's any controversies with the program, if something happened. I haven't heard anything about that.
I think it may be too popular and it's being used as a ploy as a tactic because it is popular. And as a negotiating for something, it has to be a way to get this maybe less popular so that people say just let that go through. So but I there's no question that it benefits all the communities across Pennsylvania in which it can be applied. And I am hopeful that the proper people get in the room next year and decide and figure out a way to get it back on track moving forward.
That Rob M asked us a question about what happened to support for the education of children and youth experiencing homelessness funding proposed this session by Rep Ishmael Smith Waydell from Lancaster, given the growing population of youth dealing with homelessness in the state. Rob, I can't say if anyone knows if that particular program made in, please jump in. I was not able to locate it, but I do know that there was a $5 million bump for state homelessness aid overall. That's a 27% increase, and that's something that I know Rep Smith Waydell and many of his colleagues in the State House were pretty happy about. I'll just stop there. Is anyone aware of this program from Rep Smith Waydell making it into the budget? Yeah,
I'm not real familiar with it, but it is a program, again, that affects every school district just about the state. Maybe not northern Pennsylvania, but I know even here in rural York County and the suburban York County and the city of York, which is very urban, it's in every school district. So it's not something that's just like you could say, well, that's Philadelphia, that's Pittsburgh, or whatever. It's affecting all school districts, this homelessness problem.
Absolutely, would agree with that. And that's one of the reasons why the definition of poverty really needs to be the school definition of economically disadvantaged, because it takes into consideration students who are identified as experiencing homelessness and require and are entitled to, under federal law, additional supports at school. So, absolutely agree, additional funds are necessary, and fixing the poverty definition would help toward that.
We also had a question on the new tax on EV. Is that a blanket fee? What about a Toyota plug-in hybrid that uses electric for 25 miles and shifts to gas? Same tax rate as Tesla. That's from Charlotte M. Well, no, Charlotte, I am the one I can answer this definitively, which is plug-in hybrids will pay a 25% of the EV fee. So that's $50 starting in 2025. It'll be $200 for an electric vehicle, a full EV. I guess I'm maybe not the person to ask about exact definitions, but I can tell you that plug-in hybrids have a lower price. And does anyone want to add anything on that? I mean, I know that EVs were an issue that seemed like it was troubling the General Assembly for quite a long time.
Yeah, I mean, this is another thing that had to be addressed simply because, everybody says, well, they're cleaning the environment up, helping with the environment. Well, that's true, but they're still heavy on the road as other cars are, and they need to contribute to our infrastructure and our highways. I get it. You did a good job and wanted to save the environment. But again, nobody should be exempt from paying a user tax on our highways.
Yeah.
And I think on that note, I just we'll thank everyone for coming out here today and talking about our state budget on a Thursday night. It's important to be an engaged citizen, and we thank you for making that choice, particularly with everything happening. Thank you everyone on the panel, Christina, Mustafa, Stan, I really do appreciate it. And you can read more of our journalism at spotlightpa.org. We have a bunch of coverage that covered some questions that were asked in more detail, or questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. So you can also find more events that we're going to talk about, state government, the budget, what have you, at spotlightpa.org/topic/events. And if you have any questions or comments, they can be directed to Yasmin Piper. That's YPIPER at spotlightpa.org, or events at spotlightpa.org. And also thank you, Yasmin, for organizing this as always. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you learned a little bit about our state budget today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen and Spotlight.
Thank you all.